Did you have a choice of other ones, or?
Yeah, I did. I chose look.
So you went with the weird one that.
Yeah, and then in back cover.
Okay. Yesterday we did practice with thesis statement again. So remember strategies, purpose, argument. And as we do again a couple things throughout the course of the next few weeks, this is going to be your go-to sentence structure for a thesis. So try not to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes people like to fight me on this. Not fight me, but hey, I'll switch it up. I'm going to start with my argument, and then I'm going to get into the rhetorical devices. And more often than not, it ends up being really awkward and clunky. Go with this. You know, it's meant to kind of help you. Some folks like to add on to the sentence, which you can. I'm not going to yell at you if you do. Can you think of, and people will tend to do this at the beginning of the sentence, can you think of any like couple of phrases or words that you could potentially add to the beginning of that sentence that we have up here? Yeah.
But like in the statement or your introducing the book or the author.
And that certainly can happen, and I think in an in-class essay that would be more likely to happen. Take-home essay you probably won't, because your thesis is going to be that last sentence of the intro, so you're going to establish what is the context of what we're looking at. And in your big course syllabus, not that you have to turn to it right now or anything, but in your big course syllabus, when you get past the dead words, there is like an essay outline that's, for you to look at. Again, it's meant to help you. It's not meant to control where you are going to go, because there's certainly more than one way to present something. But usually we'll already have our hook, identify what's the significance of what we're looking at, mention the author of the work, slide into the background of the story of the novel, and then we'll hit them hard with the thesis here. But yeah, that is something that can happen. You shouldn't have to worry about it, because it would tend to be a little redundant, assuming you've already done those things. But yeah, that is something that can get included. Anything else? I'm thinking of two words. One begins with an S and one begins with a U. I already gave you one.
In the word that starts with S.
It's capitalized. It starts with Stein. It ends with Beck. Steinbeck uses. Okay, a lot of folks quote Steinbeck uses. This is going to seem really nitpicky, but if we were to go with Steinbeck uses biblical allusions, imagery, and motif to prove that Caleb Trask's personal suffering positively impacts him as a character, technically, what is now the subject of my thesis statement? Like grammatically, what's the subject? Steinbeck, okay? And nothing against him, but really, what is the subject matter of my essay? The strategies, the rhetorical devices, the biblical allusions, the imagery, the motif. So it would, if the subject matter is really going to be those strategies, it would make sense to me that I want the subject of that thesis statement to be those strategies. No, it would not like make or break the essay. Abby goes Steinbeck uses, we're not going to cross it off and go minus 12 points. But I don't think it's necessary, and it's a subtle little thing that kind of diverts the attention, the focus away from what you're really looking at. I promise you, Steinbeck's name is going to get used a lot in your essay, whether you use his name in the thesis statement or not. Besides him showing up in a bunch of parentheses with page numbers and all that kind of stuff. So he will get his appropriate face time. Maybe a way that you start to introduce, the idea of biblical allusions is Steinbeck's use of biblical allusions, permeates throughout the course of the book. And that could be a topic sentence, and then you get into the stuff later on, in the paragraph with it. But I think for the thesis, you really don't have to worry about putting in Steinbeck uses. One other little subtle thing here. Notice the verb tense. Positively impacts him as a character. It's impacts, it is not impacted. All right, it's present tense. So while writing about what happens in the book, it is present tense. Now, yes, past tense could still kind of show up in a couple instances, or if in the background of the novel, as you're setting the stage for some things in your intro, you mentioned how World War II, was fought in the 19-teens, that would be okay, although that's a to-be verb. Emma would circle that with it and just get upset, so don't use was. But if you're writing about, characters, if you're writing about even Steinbeck's argument, Steinbeck argues, Steinbeck states, all that's going to be present tense because it's still, living, breathing within the book itself. So just a couple little things there. Any other questions about this sentence structure, type, setup, all those things? All right. All what's going on here. Once this recalibrates, I'm going to write DIDLS, and we're going to find examples of DIDLS in chapters 8 or 9. So you can start flipping through chapters 8 and 9 and going, ooh, here's an example. In no particular order. It's not that we're going to do all the diction ideas first and then imagery. We can certainly bounce around all that we want. But within chapters 8 and 9, were there any specific words? Were there any images? Were there anything that you go, I think this might be a detail, but I'm not 100% sure. Can you tell me? That you have?
I think this is either imagery or details, but a lot of the times they always talk like really go in depth of what Kathy looks like.
Mm-hmm.
The golden hair and really the
So like page 73, that second full paragraph, her hair was gold and lovely, white said hazel eyes, like that whole area?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd absolutely go imagery with that. That whole paragraph is essentially imagery. So there is physical description, gold, lovely, and not just within, I mean, obviously the wide eyes, they're also going to get some other terms that get used a little bit later on to describe her. On page 78, dainty and sweet, okay, would be words to use to get to describe her. So certainly have plenty of imagery. Thinking of those words, which are definitely imagery, I'm not trying to change Alex's answer to it. By looking at the words gold, lovely, dainty, sweet, in context of Kathy, Kate, whatever kind of names you want to go with, anything else automatically kind of start to pop in your head. It's irony. Why is it irony? She's a monster. Monster. What can we do with monster? It could be diction. Monster even kind of becomes somewhat like symbolic. Yeah, symbolic is going to combine metaphor and symbol. Symbolic or metaphorical as well. But I think, yeah, diction would be a good thing to use there right at the beginning. So starting with one thing can lead us into a whole bunch of other examples right off the bat. Monster, irony. I don't say this to yell at Sarah saying irony, because it's definitely irony. There's a really good, did you say irony? Oh, who said irony? You said irony. I'm just going to yell at you anyway. As you get older, you can't remember anything. Any J words you can think of that is kind of similar to irony? See, that's why I was going to say your name, but I'm going to call it Abby.
Juxtaposition.
How would you explain juxtaposition? And that's the word I was thinking.
Side-by-side comparison.
Okay? That usually, I would agree with you, it's a side-by-side comparison. That you normally would not associate. So the idea that, you know, dainty and sweet associating with a monster, those things kind of juxtapose one another. So juxtaposition would be a possibility that you can use. You'll find out, you know, after a couple weeks that I really like juxtaposition. I really like juxtaposition because I think it gives you a lot of flexibility with things. Again, that's not me twisting your arm, going that Morgan's going to use juxtaposition in her essay. Become more familiar with these things as we go along. Words can juxtapose one another. Actions can juxtapose one another. What else can juxtapose one another? Especially when there's two of them in sets of two throughout books. Right? Characters can juxtapose one another. Foil characters, you know, are kind of like an example of juxtaposition. So if you wanted to, if there was an aspect, so Cal was our example from yesterday, all right? For our thesis statement. One of the things about Cal that very well could write about as to how he is an underdog or personal suffering, he's a pretty dark, brooding character a lot of the time. What really emphasizes the fact that he is so dark and brooding? His brother's the golden boy that everyone notes on, that always has a happy tune going on in his head. Okay? Let's go see Mommy sometime. Oh boy. Where did we start, little child? Oh yeah, you're the same age as me. But you know, you could end up writing about one character to emphasize other aspects about another. Who would be a character that juxtaposes Kathy? Not in this chapter necessarily, but you know, throughout the course of the book. Pardon? Yeah, Abra would be one.
Lee.
Yeah, Lee could definitely be one. Samuel would absolutely be one. And the nice thing, and not that Abra and Lee wouldn't work as well, you definitely have an interaction with Samuel and Kathy. You definitely have interactions between Adam and Kathy. So you could write certainly about some of those characters and some details and aspects about them could help emphasize certain points about whoever your main focal point would be. So that's where something like, I think, juxtaposition comes in handy because it gives you a lot of freedom. At the same time, you know, if Johnny's sitting there going, no, I don't like this juxtaposition idea, I'm not comfortable with it yet, then you would be an idiot to use it. You know, go with something that you're more comfortable with, go with the devices that you like, the examples are going to work, but understand that there are, you know, a lot of options out there beyond what we probably simply state with today. What else? Notice. And there could be, I'm sorry to cut you off, there could be other examples of imagery that we go with, or other examples of diction. It's not like we've used that up. No.
On page 74, like the second half of the page, they say liar all the time.
Mhm.
Syntax is repetition.
Okay, so we got repetition of liar. There is, and Steinbeck does this a lot too, just we're talking about repetition. On 77, he repeats the pronoun she a ton. In like the third, what's that? That's the fourth paragraph on page 77 at the beginning of sentences, she. So he does a lot of repetition. He does a lot of parallel structure depending what you're looking at. With syntax, repetition is usually going to be a main starting point. If, say, which paragraph was your liar?
The fourth and the fifth. There's lies.
Oh, yep, thank you. So, lies gets used, you know, as noun in most of the sentences. It's not going to be in the same spot. You know, it's not always at the beginning of the sentence. It's not always at the end of the sentence. The one that I mentioned on 77, she, is at the beginning of all those sentences. So technically someone could go fancy and go, oh, that's anaphora because it's at the beginning of the sentences. I could say repetition, and I could use your lies and my she, and I would still be correct. So I could go with that more general term if I wanted, and that would give me the freedom to pick and choose. If I were to say, all right, he uses anaphora, then I have to go with words that are going to be at the beginning of the sentences. So I think sometimes people try to get themselves a little too specific, where the term repetition would work perfectly, and you could be able to use words that are showing up in different spots. I would, since we're talking about repetition here, if you were to write an essay only about this chapter, which you're not, I think lies would work better as a syntactical repetition thing as opposed to like a motif of it coming up. Because for it to be motif, it's going to be ongoing, mentioned throughout. Our examples, we're more looking in close paragraphs and sentences that are by one another, so it's going to be a little bit more condensed than what like a motif would be. But yeah, absolutely, syntax.
In the middle of page 79, when Steinbeck is describing like James Grew, his sentences get a lot shorter.
Mhm.
The syntax there. It says he became a man who walked on his toes and sang to himself. It's like, they're a lot shorter.
This could be a difficult question to answer sometimes. For you as a reader, what does that do when there's like shorter, when you start to notice shorter sentences after, not super long ones, but lengthier?
I feel like it becomes simpler. I don't know how to explain it.
Okay. So you're noticing change in sentence structure once James Grew gets mentioned.
Yeah.
Boy, that guy was one letter off from being really rich. He could have had a clothing line.
Oh my gosh.
Hey, you figured it out. Some folks are still thinking. Any other, so you notice it a little bit simpler. Any other ideas? Like what a shorter sentence does?
For me, it builds up like a bit of suspension, or like, I don't know, it makes me feel like urgent or something's happened, or like it's right after something happened, and
tends to be a quicker pace, and so yeah, like a whole suspense kind of idea can build up.
It's like, because it's the only thing in the sentence, it catches your attention, it makes it more important.
Yeah, for a lot, and again, this isn't one size fits all. But yeah, emphasis. And I think suspense is something that certainly builds up a lot. For you as a writer, I could see you using shorter sentences when you want to emphasize a point. Like if you got a main thing to get across and you build it up into this big, long, compound, complex sentence with 4 semicolons and 8 dashes, by the time we get to the end of the sentence, we forgot what you started with. And not that it is a, 5-sentence word or a 5-word sentence or anything like that. That's one of the reasons why I don't really want you to do Steinbeck uses, or in East of Eden Steinbeck uses. In his quintessential American novel, East of Eden, wonderful writer John Steinbeck utilizes blah, blah, blah. You're losing the reader as to what is the point that you really want to emphasize. So if you have a key point to emphasize, whether it be a thesis statement, whether it's something in your body paragraphs, yeah, I'd go with a shorter sentence. I'd go with something that's a little bit more direct. If you are coming across a reading of something where there's a lot of shorter sentences after lengthier ones, you're probably looking at a point of emphasis with it. Is Gru an important character as to who the becoming of Kathy is? Yeah, absolutely. And so it can be a little bit of a signal. Even though there's not like a big metaphor here, pay attention to what's going on in this part, because now you're going to start to kind of learn who Kathy is. Oh, yeah, I already started figuring out at that point. Virginia?
It's like, for language, also on page 79, it says Caesar and Cicero, which is
Mm-hmm. Good. Guess what word I wrote at the top of the first paragraph for 79? It's my favorite J word. Juxtaposition. Any idea why in that first paragraph, like that paragraph that starts at the bottom of 78, I wrote juxtaposition?
It says Kathy grew more lovely all the time.
Okay, that's one. Yep, that's one part. And also delicate. You still have that golden hair and all that stuff at the bottom of 78. Agree?
A little mouthful of sweetness.
Okay, little mouthful of sweetness. Delighted her mother and father. She wanted to be a teacher. Her parents took honor in who she is. Yeah, she's going to kill you a little bit. And she's going to run a whorehouse. Actually, she's going to kill someone to take their whorehouse, and then she's going to run her whorehouse. That's not a teacher.
I'm slow. What happened? Wait.
James Crew is a quote, or J. Crew's a quote.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, jokes. Over the head.
So yeah, illusion, we got going. Juxtaposition, we certainly have going. Irony, we still, and you could use that at the same point that, her parents take pleasure in who she is, they're delighted by the way she acts, and yeah, this is what's going to happen. What else?
I have a
Question?
Yeah, I just have a question. It doesn't exactly relate to this, but why did Steinbeck choose for the book to be told from the perspective of Almo's son, and why? Just why? I don't understand.
Well, number one, and this is where things bleed together for me. I can't remember where we've talked about this or we haven't talked about this, and this was a period 7 conversation or whatever. Steinbeck's parents, literally, are Olive Hamilton and Ernest Steinbeck. So they are characters in the book, but he literally places himself, in a sense, as the narrator. So they're the chapter 14, Olive in the Airplane, is a personal anecdote about his own mother.
Oh, really?
Okay. Now that's not to say therefore everything is accurate, because it is not. It's a good question. It's one that he's never fully kind of explained. It's certainly experimental. Some could say it's kind of arrogant.
Yeah.
I'm going to write a book, and I am going to put myself in it. I would say it's inconsistent because it's first person, but then it sometimes kind of shifts to a third person. Sometimes it's limited, sometimes it's omniscient. So he's kind of going all over with it. So he certainly, I think, wants to personalize it somewhat, but it is fact and fiction. I think partially, which family is the main family of the book? Trasks or Hamiltons? It's a book about the Trask family, okay? And this is hard to do because you already read it, hopefully. If you were to eliminate the Hamiltons from it, how would the mood of the book be? There's no Hamiltons. We're just focusing on Trasks. Sure, Samuel might show up, but there's going to be very little Hamiltons. Emily, did you? Yeah, it would be really depressing. And you could argue it already is depressing in some ways. So it would be very depressing. In a lot of ways, even though he is not the protagonist, I'd say Samuel is the heroic character. So you have this dark, broody, allegorical Trask family that is cursed. You got to have something to kind of help with it. So he brings in the Hamiltons. I don't know if he's thinking of like personal things and going, oh, we had such a nice, happy family. Steinbeck did not have a nice, happy family the whole way throughout. I mean, the guy got married like 4 times and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't that everything was peachy for him. But I think you wanted to kind of balance it a little bit. You can't have all Trasks because you're not going to get anyone past a certain part. I also think, and I'm kind of thinking of Grapes of Wrath as I say this, which isn't fair to you because you haven't read it. His big, lengthy books, and even the little ones like The Pearl, I think he tries to go with universal messages that are out there. So the Pearl is much more of a parable, with it being so much shorter, but there's some universal truth that you can learn from it. I think by making him the narrator is his way of going, this isn't just about this fictional family, but this could apply to all. I mean, one of the obviously main parts of the book, I think, is that whole idea of choice, which is something that you're going to investigate in your second essay. That just because you are, a descendant of Cain doesn't mean you are stuck in a world of sin forever. You have a choice, you have the ability to kind of break free of that. And I think by him putting himself in the story, it kind of helps that point. And gives a little bit more of a universal appeal as opposed to, we're solely about the Trasks. You could read it and go, well, I'm not in that family. They're really screwed up. Good thing I'm not. Oh well, I don't have to worry about it. I think it's his way of kind of broadening out that there is a universal appeal regardless of your spirituality, of your religion. I think that's one of the main reasons why Lee is the philosopher.
Yeah.
It's not that you have to be, the prototypical American to kind of figure this out. Regardless of your ethnicity, your culture, there again is some universality to it. That it's not just an American thing. It's not just a Chinese thing or a Russian or whatever ethnicity you want to go with. And also, I think with Lee, Lee comes off as a very stereotypical character, especially with that pidgin English early on. And then he starts talking to Samuel and you go, whoa, I wasn't expecting that based on the way that he was presenting it. Hey, books can be deceiving. And so again, that universal approach, I think, is what he's trying to do with it. But you could go, he's being a little arrogant too. But
I was just confused because he kept saying like, I think this and I believe this, and I didn't know it was unreliable.
And also, Steinbeck is writing this in the 40s and late 40s, early 50s. So publication's 52. He's well established at this point. Pearl was published in 37. Grapes of Wrath was published in 39. So he kind of has the ability to do some of that stuff. If Quentin Tarantino wants to make a weird movie, because that's what he does, he can. Because if it's a flop, guess what? Doesn't matter. It's already established who he is. And so he can do something experimental in 1952 that he might not be able to do in 1934 when he's not John Steinbeck. And some people ripped him for it, for putting in himself as the narrator. Like, that's dumb. You can't do that. Sure, I can. I did. Who cares?
Wait, this is kind of like a side question. But so when we read The Pearl, I feel like comparatively, they're completely different books and different writing styles and different plot lines.
I would agree.
Are all of his books like that? They're all different?
They all have, I would say, some different kind of characteristics to him. At the same time, if you were to take this and The Pearl, you're kind of dealing with a cursed family in a way. You're certainly dealing with choices that you make. You're certainly dealing with some allegorical, maybe not biblical allusion, allegorical things with the pearl, but there's still, as I said, like that parable kind of idea. And he does tend to focus on the disadvantaged, those that are being pushed down. And sometimes they triumph, sometimes they don't. You know, the pearl will kind of be one where they don't really triumph as nearly as much. Remember, anyone know where Steinbeck's from? Salinas, California. Okay, so and you know a lot. So he focuses on California a lot, and a lot of his books, Californians come off as rotten scoundrels of people. He leaves California, he goes East Coast, he comes back. He goes to Stanford. You know, so in some ways, Aaron and him have a lot of similarities, and then he leaves, doesn't go to France, but he leaves and kind of gets a more worldly perspective of what's going on and comes back. But a lot of his books do tend to be more Western, although, you know, Mexico is a little bit different with the Pearl. But he does tend to take a look at people who are kind of dispossessed or at a disadvantage. Tends to be a big thing for him. I think, you know, if you subconsciously, if it worked for you before, you kind of go back to it again. What else?
This is like later on in the two chapters, but it's like page 97, whenever Mr.
Okay.
Edwards finds out about the fire, then he keeps repeating, like, in the first chapter, like a redness glowed in his head behind the eyes, and then again in 98, it says that 4 paragraphs down, his cold control was burst through with a red word.
Okay, so I think I know where you want to go with it, but what were you thinking so far as like with the focusing on the redness?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like, I was thinking like imagery, but then it also might be language. I just don't know.
Okay. I feel that most of the time we would probably go with it as being like the imagery, you know, with the redness that kind of keeps coming up a little bit. Would I mean, that last one that you have on 98, you know, his frantic hand found a stone on the ground, his cold control was burst through with a red roaring wave. I mean, you could certainly go metaphor with it if you were focusing on that one. If you were coming back to that redness that comes up, I think imagery would be one that would give you a little bit more flexibility because it doesn't have to be a metaphor for like every single one. You could take a look, and I even wrote next to that sentence at the end, alliteration, because you have cold control was burst through with a red roaring wave, and alliteration, syntax in general tends to be a point of emphasis. So you could do some syntactical things with it too. The fact that it gets repeated, kind of like how we talked about with lies before, and you could look at repetition, alliteration, syntax of like a singular sentence. You could look at repetition of how that color keeps kind of coming up over and over and over again. If you were looking at how, like, what do you associate with color red? Blood. What else, just like in general? What else? What? Anger? The kind of combination of those two, violence, love that has gone wrong. It was love for him, I guess it kind of was, her not so much. So if you wanted to take a look at why it's important that color keeps coming up, you could do like some color association with it. What you wouldn't want to do is the fact that the color red is so significant to, like, you know, people in general. The fact that it gets repeated is important. You would want to mention, well, what is it that you associate with it as to why it would be appropriate there. But yeah, that one would certainly work. And you have a lot of imagery too that kind of like takes place. You know, even the very last sentence on page 99, the roosters were crowing in the chicken house, and a gray rim of dawn lay on the east. Gray rim, you know, for dawning a new day. You know, gray is usually not the color that you associate. Where is she at this point? She is getting to the Trask farm, and really, when you think about it in that way, gray rim of a new dawn, boy, Adam, there's a whole new beginning that's coming to your life, and you have no idea what's in store for you. Now that gray color actually kind of makes some sense in that regard. Anything that you think might work detail-wise? Just because we don't have any up here yet. For chapters 8 or 9. You can go on that?
I don't have a page number yet, but the fire started at 3 o'clock. Just straight up.
Okay.
It's a fact.
Okay. Well, in the fire as a whole. Okay. So, what are some significant details about the fire? So, number 1, 3 o'clock.
Started in the oven.
Okay.
When she grew up, an apron in there.
Well, she. Why does she throw the apron in the fire? Okay, we're getting rid of it, so there's some metaphorical kind of aspect. I would say there's also a logic, I don't know if logic is the right word. There's also a specific reason.
She got the blood on it, but
She got the chicken blood, which she puts in the jar, which then she keeps under the stairs. The blood's on the apron gets burned. What has she eliminated? Evidence. But she has blood now that she can throw out whenever. What's the constable kind of, this isn't right, thinking about? Can't prove anything, but what's bothering the constable? There were no keys in the locks. So these details about the fire, about the whole scene, certainly could be significant. And so doing all of those things, what does that prove about Kathy? She plans things out. She's very deliberate. There's also a word that gets used to describe her a good bit as well. She is very, very, begins with a P. Not really thinking of chapters 8 and 9, kind of thinking beyond, but she is very patient. Okay, she does not do rash things, very rarely. She only really kind of starts to lose that patience towards the end, of the book and her life. So those details could go a long way towards describing how patient and meticulous she is at dotting her I's and crossing her T's.
Wouldn't you do that with like the preemptive stuff to the fire too, like the fact that she didn't have out or something that was yellow and rust or like something along
Well, and how is she acting even before all that stuff? She's like the perfect person all over again, and Dad's, hey, maybe we actually did kind of get this fixed right and everything's okay. What does Dad do? More details. What does Dad do that he's becoming very proud of with his daughter that pays dividends for her after the fire? Well, yeah, but I'm thinking afterwards, when everything's going well, shows her everything at the business. Combination of the safe, knows the papers, the works, all that kind of stuff. So you got this fire, you have this robbery. I mean, we know who did all of it, but again, it's part of that long-term planning that she tends to do. So certainly when it comes to the fire, the tannery, those would be, where the business, those would be places where you have details. For description, how's her feet get described? Of course, it's one of the questions that you just had on your quiz. They're hooves. Okay, does that do anything for you? I didn't know if you were going to say the sound at the end of that word. So animalistic, non-human, dainty, but there's definitely a demon, devilish, monstrous quality about her. Someone said that a friend of Steinbeck, critic, was like, and talks about this in the introduction to the book, I don't believe in Kathy. There's not enough human quality to her. And he's like, she's all Satan. There is not meant to be, goodness in her. She is total evil. So I think even that little detail about the feet, that demon quality adds to it. So the idea is, you start thinking of what are examples that you want to take a look at, and then you can start to associate these different devices with them. All right? Test on Monday, and then you're reading I Have a Dream, but really I'd say weekend you're focusing on both between test and essay. Say I Have a Dream for focus test. Don't confuse yourself yet. Or anything.